today's first panel, we plan to pick up from that conversation with that Mona and I had with Brian, and I do so by introducing one of Canada's best moderators. David Walmsley was named as the Globe and Mail's 12th editor-in-chief in 2014. Under his leadership, the newspaper has won the annual Michener Award for Meritorious Public Service Journalism 3 times over, and has dominated the annual National Newspaper Awards. He's a member of the World Editors Forum of the World Association of Newspapers. He is also the most recent past chair of the Canadian Journalism Foundation and a governor of the Long Run Institute. He is one of the most perceptive observers of the Canadian and international scene, and he joins us from his studios in the Greater Toronto area. David, a very warm welcome, and thank you very much for joining us today, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Lawrence, and thanks to Mona and yourself for co-hosting this and for the great discussion with Brian. It's my pleasure to moderate this discussion today. Its title is Adapting Purpose for the Post-Pandemic World. And what are the emerging roles and responsibilities of the public corporation? So we're going to continue to build on the conversation that both yourself and Mona have just had with Brian and the exchange of ideas. Our panelists, who I'm going to introduce, bring great depth of experience and knowledge in both the risk and financial services industries. So to begin with, Rahul Bhardwaj is President and CEO of the Institute of Corporate Directors. The organization and its 15,000 members are committed to improving national outcomes by growing the board leadership and governance capacities within Canadian businesses, agencies, and not-for-profits. Rahul himself serves on several boards and chairs the global network of director institutes, which develops and promotes leading practices and programs that help directors drive sustainable performance for the benefit of shareholders, the economy, and society at large. Prior to joining the ICD, Rahul was a corporate lawyer at a leading Canadian law firm. Next up is Professor John Turner. John's a professor of finance and financial history at Queen's University in Belfast and is the founder of the Centre for Economic History. He has been a Hublon Norman Fellow at the Bank of England and an Alfred Chandler Fellow at Harvard Business School. John's research focuses on the long-run evolution of banking, bubbles, corporate law, and financial markets, and recently co-authored the book Boom and Bust, A Global History of Financial Bubbles, listed recently as a Financial Times Best Book of the Year for 2020. And Sevaun Palvetzian leads the communication and corporate social responsibility programs across Rogers' multiple platforms, including wireless, cable, business services, TV, radio, and sports, if that wasn't enough. Sevaun served for 6 years as CEO of Civic Action, a Toronto-based not-for-profit that boosts civic engagement to build better cities. And previously, Sevaun held senior executive strategy and communication roles within the Ontario government. A voice of influence and advocacy on many urban issues, Sevaun was named one of Canada's top 100 most powerful women in 2018. So panelists, welcome. By way of setting up this conversation, we're going to give each of the panelists 5 minutes to share their views on the subject of this discussion. And a reminder of the various perspectives provided today will range from corporate to public, academic to Bay Street and Wall Street. And that, of course, is intentional for the purpose of getting the best ideas to follow. So I thought we should begin with the round robin, 5 minutes each, and we will begin, please, with you, Rahul.
Right. Well, thank you very much, David. It's a pleasure to be here and to see the fellow panelists. You know, after hearing the earlier conversation, you change all your thinking around what you want to really focus on. But I think, to anchor the conversation a little bit, from my perspective at least, is, we're talking about resilience in a corporation, but we're also talking about how do we build out resilience in the corporate sector across the country and integrate it with building a muscle of a country that can really respond to what's happening worldwide right now. But when I bring it right back down to the heart of resilience, We're talking about the ability to respond to uncertainty, whether that's on a national level or whether that's on a very basic corporate level. And I think we're going to get into the conversation around where's culture, strategy, and risk all fit within this. But in a broader context, I'm reminded about the profound shift that's taking place out there. We talk about it in the context of moving from shareholder primacy to some other sort of primacy, or working in a multi-stakeholder environment. And you can unpack that, because there are those who say that was always the case, but there are those that are saying now, no, the promises that were made in the past aren't being kept, and now we need to broaden how we look at that and what we're going to be able to look to the corporation to really provide. And as we saw in the earlier conversation, we're also talking about what's the relationship between the corporation and society in general. And, maybe to leave some time so we can get into the conversation, I also want to put out there, we can think about the corporation, not only within the country itself, but in a global situation. So obviously, geopolitics, uncertainty, digital, the rise of different countries, corporations are working in a fundamentally different space now than they were before. Profound governance implications to that. But also, when we get into our questions, we're going to be touching on aspects of, what goes to the very core of how we look at corporations and how we look at our country and how we navigate a lot of these changes. And where I'm actually pointing at is to look a little bit even at China. Now we're starting to look at another strategy from another part of the planet that's had profound success, but on very different terms. So I think when we start looking at what Canada and Canadian corporations are doing, we'll touch on trust, but we also need to think about imagination and innovation, and how do we think about a different future, and how wedded to these very fundamental ideologies that we are rooted in, that have a great basis in a lot of things, but how we may need to rethink that, and how do we build our muscle to be able to do that, both at the corporate level and at the societal level. And ultimately, to me, that is the journey of resilience.
I love that. That is, you've just unsheathed the sword. All right. Before I digress, John, you're up.
Thanks, David. So, of course, I teach in a business school, so I want to do this, answer this a question and present my views through a case study, through an example. So I want to talk about the Anglo-Dutch multinational Unilever, because Unilever is a pioneer when it comes to corporate purpose. And it had corporate purpose right back at the company's inception. Back in 1883, when the Sunlight Soap Company was launched in the UK by William Lever, who later became Lord Leverhulme. This was a very innovative company, but right from the start, it had purpose. And its purpose was to popularize cleanliness and to bring it within the reach of ordinary people, working class people in Britain. Added to that, Lever Brothers, as it was then, was also a generous benefactor of universities, of civic institutions. Lever himself was renowned for his moral capitalism, and he was heralded as an enlightened entrepreneur. However, Lever Brothers ran into trouble when Lever's palm olive plantations in the Belgian Congo were found to have relied on forced labor. So corporate purpose didn't prevent corporate misdemeanor. And so for me, a purposeful corporation that treats its employees badly, no matter where they are in the world, is not acting responsibly. Purpose, for me, needs to include workers. Well, Unilever today is still driven by purpose. With their products, they claim to have improved the health and hygiene of 1.3 billion people over the past decade. And then the acquisition of Ben & Jerry's by Unilever back in 2000, made a lot of sense. So here's one brand, with a social mission, acquiring another brand with a social mission. However, this summer when I was in London, I walked past Unilever's corporate headquarters there on the Victoria Embankment, and outside was a large group of protesters. And me being the nosy Irishman that I am, I went over and just figure out what was going on, because I knew it was Unilever's headquarters. And I was handed a leaflet. And the leaflet told me that Ben & Jerry's had just announced that it would no longer allow its ice cream to be sold in Israel's settlements in the occupied West Bank, and it wouldn't be renewing its licensing agreement with its franchise in Israel. In other words, Ben & Jerry's is boycotting Israel. And the people outside were protesting and calling on Israel and calling on the Jewish diaspora to then boycott Unilever. And I love that word boycott because it's a word that Ireland give to the world, named after a Captain Boycott. So for me, the question then is, should corporations take sides on these, controversial political, social issues? Do corporations leave themselves open to claims of hypocrisy and inconsistency? So China is the largest luxury ice cream market as well in the world, but it's a major persecutor of Muslims, Christians, and other minority groups. So should Ben & Jerry's their boycott not extend there, or do they only take issues or a stance on issues that really affect their bottom line, or are they just virtue signaling? So the question that I'm throwing out there, and I'm not sure what the answer is, should social political missions be part of corporate purpose? Or do we maybe need to rephrase Milton Friedman's famous dictum, the business of corporation is not politics, leave that to the governments. So with that, David, I'll end my introductory remarks.
Okay. Going to be good and keep us on track. I'm not, wow, Captain Boycott, I never heard of him. Sevaun, 5 minutes, go for it.
Well, thank you. I want to start by thanking BMO and the Institute as well for inviting us to be part of this discussion. I cannot imagine a more important time in history for the role of the corporation in how it contributes to society to be a dialogue. So thank you for the opportunity to join this morning. Like John, I'm a big fan of history. I have a couple degrees in history and have been fascinated to see the role of how we curate a business executive with the priorities and some of the ones that we're touching upon today. The Industrial Revolution made everything about the focus of efficiencies. How do I get more efficient in producing widgets, in making sure that my workers are effective? And the very first MBA class of Harvard in 1908, that was the focus, right? The Taylor Scientific Method. If you fast forward, 100 plus years, and we think about, I remember reading Roger Martin, a wonderful thinker in Canada, dean of a business school for many years here in Canada, saying, wait a minute. Efficiencies and productivity is important, but we need to talk about resilience. We need to balance it with resilience. And for me, that was a bit of an aha moment when the leader of one of the world's best MBA schools is saying that resilience is a topic that we need to counter up against as it relates to efficiencies. It's not just about efficiencies. And so that to me is a symbol of how some of these points of evolution have happened, and we stand on the precipice of what is the future of the corporation in playing in this world. As David cited, my background, I've had the privilege of working for government. I've had the privilege of working in the NGO and charitable sector. I've had the privilege of working internationally, and I have the privilege of serving in corporate Canada. I've seen how the puck is moving in terms of what obligations we need businesses to assume in addressing these big critical problems that societies face. Let's look at governments for a minute. Incredible influence, incredible responsibility, crushing debt. We cannot afford to spend our way out of the social or environmental problems that we have by government alone. And even if we did, the thought process that involves an entire sector, right, that needs to be infused in thinking through those problems cannot be addressed with white papers, blue ribbon panels, or task force of corporate sector alone. It needs to be immersive. Okay, that's government. Let's think about the NGO sector. After the Second World War, you could count on one hand the number of NGOs in this city. I live in Toronto, and it was a powerful group that evolved. Canada has the second largest NGO sector in the world. So there is a richness of bench strength in terms of serving the communities, the social serving sector, but it has grown up to be this incredible influence that wants to play in the circle, but needs a lane in. Right? And so then we look at the corporations and we think about the role of companies. It is more than just serving shareholders. It is about serving stakeholders. We heard that in the earlier comments offered, and Brian pointed out the obligation that employees expect to see, the obligations that consumers expect to see, right? And frankly, the pantry of assets that a company has available to it in being able to contribute to social or environmental issues is so vast, so unique, that it needs to get in the game of looking at some of these purpose issues. And so from where I sit, the puck has increasingly headed toward the role of corporate business leaders and entities in thinking about purpose and thinking about the role of resilience in society. And I think it's very exciting to see what the leadership changes in that front are leading to, with real impact and real change.
Thank you, Sevaun. Great journey around the three areas that so many Canadians sit in between government, public sector, the NGO side, and companies. Rahul, I wanted to bring it back to you in the first instance. You used a phrase in your opening remarks with respect to whether or not companies have got the imagination to confront and adapt to the geopolitics. And sort of bordering that is to pick up a comment that Sevaun had with respect to companies and the obligations of companies. Rahul, you mentioned China. China's government is its company. How do Western countries or corporations ensure that they're able to compete? Have they got the imagination? Are the structures correct in order to compete against entire countries that are corporations?
Well, that's a really loaded question, and I won't give you a yes or a no answer because I don't know is the short answer. But I think appreciating that the environment is very different, that, despite all of our misgivings that we might have about China, to not recognize it as a strategic threat. Take everything off the table, but as a strategic threat, as a country that in 60 years has gone from, rather backwards by our standards, or developing into the largest, economy on the planet, and arguably the best Gini coefficient compared to the West. If we don't look at that, we don't recognize the strategic threat that we're up against. And you nailed it, that there's a different relationship between corporations and the state there, which is something that we're struggling with, and we're going to talk about here, is what's the relationship between corporations and the state. Depending on who you speak to, there's some who'll say, corporations, the notion was they were a means to the end, right? This was supposed to be for general societal wealth. Some would argue in a pithy way that trickle down didn't work. So, corporations ended up becoming a means or an end in themselves. And that's what we're fighting against right now, is how do we reconcile those, and what's the relationship they have in a broader society, and do they have the tools to do that? So I would say that there are lessons to be learned. I think corporations need to be aware that there are strategic threats from different models coming in different places. And to, I think, David's earlier point, around the relationship with, corporations and public policy. I'll just say a little anecdotally, when I've spoken to some directors, some senior directors, about how do they feel about their CEOs wading into this space, there's a lot of discomfort around the room, and actually a couple of giggles. They'll say, gee, we know our employees want it, we know what our customers want it, but gee, if they go out there publicly, they do so at their own risk, right? Their head could get lopped off. Or at the same token, they'll say this might be a shareholder platform that's not their platform. But we also know that when it comes to wanting to lower taxes or whatever the case may be, that's a very big public policy thing. Corporations are in there quite a bit. And so the question is, what's that relationship? And Sevaun put on the table tri-sector leadership. And I hope we get to that a little bit later, because I think that that's a part of how we actually can think our way out of this.
Thanks, Rahul. John, picking up on that, you made the comment, citing Friedman, that perhaps politics should be left to the politicians, and corporations, while perhaps vulnerable to hypocrisy if they're not looking after their employees, far away from perhaps the headlines. At the same time, the debate involving corporate futures within the political world is minimal. I think when Brian spoke in the last session about good politics isn't necessarily good policy, I think the corporate discussions when it comes to elections or the political discussions are pretty non-existent. So where is the forum to create some momentum for corporate leadership to ensure that they are on the right track if they are to stay outside of the politics debate?
Yes. So I think I can use an example from my own country, because politics for more than a century in Ireland has been a poison chalice, and corporations in Ireland typically do not comment, and for the past 100 years will not comment on domestic political matters. And so they do so because, you know, they're wanting to, you know, protect their profits. They're wanting to make sure that they're not disenfranchising their customers, etc. So they almost become apolitical. And I think that's true for corporations around the Western world. Largely, they have been apolitical. And I think there is a danger if corporations get too close to government, if the relationship's too cozy. Again, you know, thinking of another example here. So if you look at the financial crisis, you know, the global financial crisis, and you look at who was providing the campaign finance, you look at who the lobbying was coming from in the United States in particular, but also in other countries, it's coming from banks, from corporations. And I think we need to have a very clear divide between leaving politics to the politicians and leaving business to the corporations. And for me, the two don't really mix. But that could be me just reflecting my prejudice, having grown up in a politically divisive country where, you know, people tend and corporations tend not to comment on political matters.
Right. And Sevaun, one of the, you know, the interesting questions that this discussion is about is how do the corporations adapt? We've seen in the pandemic, and again, to Brian's point earlier, a full 70% of Canadians saying, my priorities have shifted. The value system has changed. I am considering family perhaps to be more important than the 1 hour commute to go and work with my colleagues, maybe 10 colleagues or 40,000 colleagues. How then do you create, do you think, within the obligation that companies have, an opportunity to provide something that satisfies both the social values of the employees and the responsibility of the company? Because I think that is the crux of the challenge as we come out of the pandemic.
So I would say, David, that some of these topics, even what John was speaking about, you know, does the company have a voice on what is viewed as a political matter? What is the role of the business sector versus government or NGO? These are artificial perforation points, okay? So these issues are felt. It's the same civilian, the taxpayer, the employee, the customer, right? It's the same person, and these are the same issues. The question is how authentically different groups are going to lean in to take action to address them, right? And so I would say what starts with a company is what is its purpose? And is it using its purpose, in our case at Rogers, around connecting Canadians? How is that purpose being lived and animated with authenticity inside the company and outside the company? One of the things that really I've been amazed at since joining this company almost 2 years ago is the level of employee engagement that exists and the extraordinary best-in-class levels of employee pride. Like 90% plus of our people are so thrilled by the way we are making a contribution to social environmental issues on the outside, seeing our purpose in action. And David, I see that evidenced in so many ways on a regular basis, but let me give you just one to give you an example of where values, culture and leadership aligns with purpose in a company setting. We're in the telecommunications world. We build networks. And we were in British Columbia with our CEO and members of our leadership team last month. There is a patch of the Highway of Tears, Highway 16, between Prince Rupert and Prince George. 252 kilometers of silence. There is no cell reception. And for decades, murdered, missing Indigenous women and girls this has been their fate. And that critical connectivity gap had yet to be addressed. And so our team went out to understand locally in partnership with community, in partnership with NGOs, where are the needs, how do we fill them, and then what are the other wraparound supports for devices for young people that need the access there, right? For some of the additional learning and skills training. And so it was a suite of involvement where our purpose was lived, yes, about connecting Canadians, but in serving some of those critical social issues that have plagued that part of British Columbia in particular for so long. The culture of our organization helps to realize that, because from the top all the way down, this idea that there is an interest in engagement is lived, and the embedded within the company to be able to make that a priority in addressing that, right? So I would say it is, for an organization to adapt, they need to have the right values, they need to have the right leadership, and they need to have the right culture to actually pull it off. And that's certainly what I've seen here.
Okay, I'm going to follow up with you on that. That sounds like an incredible story. We've done a lot of work at the Globe and Mail on the Highway of Tears, and it's a story that needs to stay in the headlines. Rahul, you're working with corporate directors. They say the right things. They know what needs to get done. But the challenge is that the tyranny of the quarter continues to play a part. So to take a neutral statement and say that people are coming into business to do the right things, they're all trying to improve society, they are trying to ensure that the role of the organization benefits all, reduces inequality. How true to purpose can they remain when short-term incentives are still a defining element of their entire role?
Sure. It's a great question, and it's one that's talked about quite a bit from a perspective of, some public companies are saying that they're refusing now to actually report on a quarterly basis because of that, and it's on. There are directors who are very keen on that the proper fiduciary duty is one that's focused on the long term. Then to your point, some will say, well, listen, you don't have a long term unless you've got a quarter by quarter that's successful. So how do you make that bridge? I think right now the focus has really been around what's the proper perspective of a director in their duty of oversight, of culture, strategy, and risk being the real heart of proper exercise of fiduciary duty. So I think right now everybody is leaning towards, let's make sure that we've got a strategy that is both flexible for the short term to make sure that it's actually able to last the long term, but let's make sure that we've got issues like culture, strategy, and risk. And when I mean risk, I mean mitigating the downside, but also seizing the opportunities within risk, and make sure that management is constantly playing out scenarios, whether they be short-term or long-term, so they can actually look towards that, and making sure that purpose is really something that guides those conversations. So it's the same answer when one would say, how do you move from, shareholder value or shareholder primacy to multi-stakeholder environment? It's a constant balance on doing that. And the trade-offs, it's one of the things we're working on at the ICD right now, is something called Chart the Future, which is really looking at the future of corporate governance. And the last chapter in that is all going to be about how do boards navigate those trade-offs. So to be honest with you, I'm looking forward to hearing about what seasoned directors are doing about that as well in real time.
And just to stay with that, Rahul, when it comes to the boards of companies, is the balance of power correct? Have we appointed the correct people? It certainly seems that there isn't the diversity that we would like to see on corporate boards. There maybe isn't the subject expertise. There's maybe too much agreement generally at boards. There's not enough of a challenge function to the C-suite. Do you think that there is an ability for the governance element of corporations to actually begin at the board level and be pushed down to reflect more where large numbers of employees feel that they would like their companies to go? Or is it going to remain a controlled sort of central control structure that we've lived with for many decades?
Sure. I would describe it as what you would describe as the past. I would say perhaps is a bit more passive in the governance. Whereas now I would say that it's becoming more active. And if you go to the US, they'll take it further and they'll say activist directors. But that's a slightly different conversation. But I think that there's been a recognition in Canadian boards in particular that the relationship between board and management is different. There's a different level of oversight, that there's far more integration between the board and strategy. So it's got to be it's going to be going onwards all of the time. That strategy isn't something that's just done once a year. It has to be far more active integration. So that's really important. And the boards are holding themselves to a higher standard these days as well. And this is really important. And this is why we're so busy in our education, is helping directors understand how to exercise that duty. And what I'm driving at there would be board evaluations. or boards looking at their matrix and saying, and looking around themselves around the table and saying, do we have the right people around the table to exercise proper oversight of strategy? So what does that mean? Do we actually have proper exercise over the culture, and what does that mean? And risk, right down to, are we at risk of unconscious bias, of groupthink? How do we make sure that we're not? So I would say that there has been a huge leap in self-awareness of boards to that particular dynamic.
That's, I think that's one of the most important takeaways, certainly in the discussions I have with board members in the C-suite in Canada, is that knowledge that they have to become much more aware, and they have become more aware, but there's a lot to do. And I think, John, to bring it to you, one of the interesting things when we move away from just the board is that question of regulation. The economic system needs two sides: corporation with purpose on the one side, and then a really effective, well-designed regulatory regime on the other. Now, if you're sitting in financial services, you're going to say you're overly regulated. It's ridiculous. You can't get anything done. If you're sitting on the regulator side, you're saying, well, these companies are so big, we can't quite trust them. So as a result of that, we're going to have to increase the level of regulation. So it's supposed to be a partnership, but it seems to have become very gummed down in the details. So if you were to start again, how would you redesign the rules when we're so interconnected, and we have also seen such profound reform in terms of the values reset that we've touched on during the pandemic, and with economic inequality that was clear to see?
Yeah, so you want to make me president for a day? What would I do? So I don't actually know what I would do, but I would have principles that would guide what I would do. And I think I would have 3 to 4 principles. First of all, I think any regulation that exists of the corporate sector should preserve and promote competition. Adam Smith, the Scottish philosopher and the founding father of economics, he hated corporations. And he hated corporations because he saw them as monopolies. He saw them as colluders. As soon as you put 2 businesses together in a room, or 2 businessmen in the room together, he said that they were going to collude. And for me, without competition, corporations become sluggish, they become uncompetitive, and then that affects the national economy. We've something in the UK called the British disease. And the British disease is we've got these really sluggish corporations, and we've had them for about a century. And why? It's largely the lack of competition that these companies face. So that's the first principle I would have. The second principle I would have is to be aware of regulatory capture, because it is possible that incumbents will push for regulation. And they do that to basically knock out the competition and to create barriers to entry. And then the third principle I would have, and this goes to the point that you made, David, is I would reduce regulatory complexity. If you look at the rules that financial institutions have faced over the past century or so, no matter what side of the Atlantic you're on, the rule books back 50 years ago were pretty slim. Even back 30 years ago were pretty slim. But today we've got a rule book and it's so complex. That makes it easier to game the system, and it also stifles innovation, because firms are spending so much time trying to figure out how to meet the regulations that they forget to innovate. And the fourth principle I would have if I was redesigning this regulatory system is to make sure that we align the incentives of politicians with citizens and not corporations. We've already mentioned this, but we want to make it difficult for politicians to interfere with regulators. We want to make it difficult for them to dilute regulation, because you bet your bottom dollar they will if they get a chance. And this means then reforming campaign finance laws, lobbying rules, keeping that sort of gap, that Chinese wall, if you like, between the politicians and the regulators, and then the regulators and the corporations. Those are principles, David. I wouldn't have the mental capacity to design a new system for you here this afternoon.
Oh, I think I'd vote for you anyway. You can be at least president for the rest of today. I think those arguments and those principles, the challenge function against all of that is that I think there's probably quite a lot of agreement around those 4 principles as an argument. And the question then becomes, what is the process that protects those as you get into the various competing elements that exist. But I'll take that away, and I think a lot of us have got some good thoughts. We're getting some nice questions from the audience as well, but I just had another question I wanted to raise, and this is an open question. Sevaun, I'll begin with you, please, and then we'll go to Rahul. It's said, there's observers say that, the following analogy about capitalism over the last 30 years, and one of the things that brought me to fall in love with the Long Run Institute and to join the board is because I'm involved in the day-to-day and the hour-by-hour in terms of a news environment. But I know, to Mona's point earlier, you lose perspective when you're in the middle of it. And this allows me to stop and think. And I think it's what a lot of business leaders also quite enjoy, is the opportunity to take the lessons from history and see if they have to be repeated. But the analogy is that over the last 30 years, capitalism has been built into something like a large apartment block. There's the penthouses at the top, and they're getting larger and larger, more beautiful. There are the apartments in the middle. You're feeling more squeezed, and the basement has flooded. Oh, and did I mention the elevator's no longer working? So, Sevaun, to you first. How do purpose-driven enterprises, you've spoken about the importance of Rogers and the feeling of engagement by employees. How do purpose-driven enterprises deal with larger society-wide issues, with the dangers and the opportunities that entail, particularly when we've seen that while we may have all been in the same storm through this pandemic, we've been on very different boats, and the economic inequality is profound?
Mm-hmm. I think, David, for me, we'll use the pandemic as a great indicator. A crisis reveals character. It doesn't produce it. It reveals it. And so we could watch where companies had engaged, healthy, values-driven cultures, their ability to take care of their people, take care of them well, right? Meet the needs that they were experiencing on a professional level, but also an individual level. In one case, raising the mental health supports as an example, because families were struggling, and making those virtual offerings possible, making sure that there are services coming in to support. I mean, our world, we have 7,000 people who answer phones here in Canada a day for the company. Before the pandemic hit, David, 800 could work from home. Within a matter of weeks, all 7,000 could work from home. But it wasn't just, can we enable that? Can we also make sure that you have the supports you need as a person, the human side of being an employee? And as you know, there is more than just dignity that comes with a paycheck. There is that sense of how we are taken care of as people. So I think one of the things that's changed in those 30 years is the assumption that companies have that they have more parts of their employee life to think about, not just the paycheck that arrives every 2 weeks. And equally, inside out. It is a very porous life, how you treat your folks on the inside, how inclusion and diversity is respected, how values are lived, and then what that shows up on the outside. And that's where the evolution from just, I'm going to write a check. I'm going to write a check and feel good about this organization. That's fundamentally changed in how companies are playing a role in corporate responsibility. It is about pantries. It is not about checks. It is not just, I'm going to write a check to the women's shelter to make sure that they have some money to function. It's about giving tens of thousands of resources where they can be available. It's about making sure that you play in the time of the crisis, again, as an example, where domestic abuse rose by 20% in many cases, putting on your media assets as a media company, what you can do as a woman who's looking for help. Again, it is that part of thinking through all parts of that house, David. Socioeconomic, absolutely. Social issues, environmental issues, absolutely. But it's thinking about society as a whole. It's not putting the company at the center of the universe. It's thinking about what are those social issues and what role do we have in helping to advance solutions to tackle them. That includes affordability. That includes the environment and climate change. That includes horrific social issues that we face still. It is that putting the issue at the center of the table, not just the bottom line of the company. It's all the edges around it.
Thanks. Rahul, I think this ties in with your opening comments where you spoke about the importance of all stakeholders as well as shareholders. What's your perspective?
So let me extend the analogy a little bit, or the description that you started with. and acknowledge that that building that we're speaking about is also in a very climate challenged environment outside the building. So there's actually an existential threat there. So we take the lens out for a second, and my easy answer on this one, or the simple one at least, is we need a new political philosophy. Now, that being said, what do you do within the building? Which is sort of your question on what can corporations do in that perspective. And I go back to the notion of tri-sector leadership. So I think at the end of the day, we're looking at corporations as entities. They're legal constructs with rights and responsibilities, but they're people. There are people that are running them, that are making decisions, whether they're on the board, management, staff. These are individuals with free will that can work together and they can come up with solutions. So it really is about individual leadership. But I want to take it one step further and say that, I talked about tri-sector leadership earlier, and I think it's probably never been more important than right now. I'm not convinced in Canada we've got the great knowledge between the three sectors. In other words, by example, in the US, despite its many faults there in the political system, if you've got a phone call from Capitol Hill to a particular company, they'll send their best person there to Capitol Hill for a couple of years to learn about how government works. And by extension, the people in government learning more about how the private sector works. There's a certain permeability between those membranes. There's some unintended poor consequences, but there are also a lot of good things that happen. And in Canada, we could do a lot more in developing our tri-sector leadership, because it helps create the language of leadership that's really touching on all these sectors. So how does a corporation actually work with government, beyond government relations, and without fear of integrating with public policy? How do they utilize and support everything that's going on in the third sector, and vice versa? Because there are a lot of leadership skills to be learned through all of this. So I think a big part of how corporations can really advance these issues and connect with them is through their leadership. And I think societally, we've got a great opportunity to build that leadership muscle. And I might add that all the business schools that many of us are working with, that's exactly the type of thing that they're trying to do, but we could do a better job of knitting it together.
Thanks, Rahul. John, we've got 5 minutes left. John, you raised, just building on what Rahul said, you raised William Unilever, and obviously it was through the sheer force of nature and his vision that he decided to push the direction of his company. We still have, and this is a question from the audience, we still have a number of very powerful families in Canada that are able to push their image, their direction as they see fit. But to build on what Rahul's saying about the tri-sector leadership responsibility, do you see that there is a rise in cooperation? Do you see that the pandemic has resulted in people appreciating that perhaps no one individual or group has the answer and people have to work closer together? Or does history tell you something differently? When we come out of an enormous change, people actually retreat and become less cooperative and become more defensive. What's your lessons?
So most people have been trying to draw parallels with what we've come through to the Spanish flu, 1918, 1919. And the Spanish flu was different in that the people that the Spanish flu killed were healthy, largely men between the ages of 30 and 45. And things really then changed after that. And we had the Roaring Twenties. And so that was a cultural phenomenon that happened. That people sort of took more risks. They were going to live life more. And so there is a possibility that after the pandemic we've come through, that people are going to take more risks, be willing to take more risks, that they're going to be willing to, change behaviors, change ways of thinking. And one of the ways of thinking may be in this whole area of cooperation, of a cooperation of how different parts of society cooperate. And actually the pandemic forced people and forced organizations, the third sector, public sector, corporations had to work together to basically make sure that we could be fed and we had the supplies that we needed. So, that the pandemic forced that. Now, whether that will last, I think that's only something time will tell. Certainly, the Spanish flu had an impact through the 1920s, and the cultural, almost cultural revolution that we had with the Roaring Twenties. It's too early to say yet whether this most recent pandemic is going to change society and behavior in the way that Spanish flu did.
A perfect historian's answer. I love it. Too soon to tell. Okay, we have 20 seconds left for each of you. Closing remarks. I could go on all day, but this has been great. Let's start with you, Sevaun, please. Last 20 seconds.
Well, I loved one of the questions that came out of the earlier segment around 10 years from now. What was this conversation going to look like? Do you know what, David? 10 years from now, I hope we're not having it. Right? 20 years ago, if you'd said the letters ESG, you'd have thought I was getting ready to start a game of Scrabble. Right? And so as I look to where the thought leadership, the committed leadership of corporate Canada and others, the collaborative potential of those three game-changing sectors that we do have in Canada that have the potential to pull some richness together, I hope 10 years from now, this is the idea that this topic would be a conference agenda focus would be ridiculous, because it is so embedded into the Canadian fabric of how these sectors work together. And this concept of purpose-driven is just an obvious as opposed to a point of distinction.
I love it. Optimism. Good. Rahul, 20 seconds.
So let me build off of that. Now, I called this a Flashback Friday. I'm going to pull out an old tweet of mine from years ago. Go something like this: financial capital might make the world go round, but social capital, trust, is what's holding it together. So as we go forward, I'd like to think that if you want to focus on one thing, it's building trust amongst stakeholders instead of trying to just manage the interests of the various stakeholders.
Thank you. And John, great to see the QUB tie on your neck. Last 20 seconds.
Yeah, so I think for me, the greatest existential threat that we face as a society is not necessarily climate change, it's inequality, because inequality is really pressing on us. And I think corporations have to act on this. And there's two things they should do. They should pay their taxes, and they should deal with exorbitant pay. So I'm just going to leave that challenge, David. Hopefully that's my 20 seconds.
I love it. And out he goes. Okay. I want to thank all of the panelists, Sevaun, Rahul, and John. That is great. There is so much more to discuss. But I'm the taskmaster, and the enemy of time has beaten us.